by the victors, remembering the American Revolution. And today the idea is to take a recontextualized look at specifically the economic conditions leading up to the American Revolution in order to better assess the effect that patriotic narratives may have had on our lasting understanding of our local history. So we'll just jump in with a brief overview of the American Revolution. I know that this probably doesn't require too much explanation, right? We've all been taught since grade school the story of the American Revolution and our nation's founding, especially Massachusetts' involvement. And for most people, just the mention of the American Revolution conjures a lot of powerful images, like this famous painting by Emanuel Leutz of General George Washington crossing the Delaware at Trenton, New Jersey on Christmas Day in 1776. So I'm sure many more images come to mind when I say how this mostly began as a series of protests, such as the infamous Boston Tea Party of 1773, in response to the quote-unquote taxation without representation being passed in several British laws, like the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1767 to 68, and the Tea Act of 1773, and of course many more. And I'm sure we're still quite familiar with how England's retaliation in the form of the so-named Intolerable Acts resulted in the unification of the 13 colonies at the First Continental Congress in 1774, with our independence officially being declared on the 4th of July, 1776, after beginning a long war that would eventually be won by brave patriots and a little bit of help from the French. So, while it might feel like an injustice to summarize one of the most pivotal events in Western history to just 3 bullet points on a single slide, I'm sure you'd agree that however reductive this version is of the American Revolution, it's nonetheless still a true version, right? There's definitely a lot I've left out that could be included, but that doesn't necessarily invalidate the information that's there. And that's pretty much the approach that I have taken in studying the American Revolution for this particular talk, right? So I'm not trying to necessarily dismantle any of the truths that we already know, more so trying to fill in the context between those truths to get a more fuller story. So with that being said, let's take a closer look in a little bit more detail about how this actually all began. Of course, with the French and Indian War, which I'm sure you've heard something about. The French and Indian War was a series of conflicts between the British Empire and their French rivals, as well as several allied Native American tribes on both sides, fighting for control over colonized regions of North America stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes and up into the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada. And this was actually just one part of a much larger global conflict that involved several other major European powers, known as the 7 Years' War, including Spain, Portugal, Austria, Sweden, and several German kingdoms. And in many ways, because of this, the 7 Years' War can almost be seen as a sort of World War Zero, right? Like a world war before anyone had really ever conceived of what a world war really was. But for our purposes, it suffices to say that the French and Indian War was the portion of the 7 Years' War that was fought in North America, right? So the 7 Years' War was taking place all over basically wherever the 7 seas went, European powers were fighting the 7 Years' War. Specifically in North America is what was called the French and Indian War, so that theater of it. A conflict on this scale, like I said, was a new concept at the time, but the actual cause of the war had been an issue for decades, and that was the fur trade, which was the oldest economy in the colonies. So France and England had been fighting a series of wars for several decades, vying for control over the fur trade, going back not just several decades, 100 years. So with two of these wars in particular, King William's War and Queen Anne's War, resulting in raids on Haverhill in 1697 and 1708 respectively. So you might remember these raids for events like the capture of Hamilton by Native Americans, and that was in the first of those so-called Indian Wars in 1697. And calling them Indian Wars is a bit of a misnomer, right? It's really meant to sort of remove the blame from the actual European powers that started those wars. So both France and England had taken advantage of animosities that already existed between Native Americans and their rival colonial powers. So in this case, the English allied themselves with the tribes like the Iroquois from the Great Lakes region, because the Iroquois had been losing land to the French for decades at this point. On the other hand, the French allied themselves with tribes like the Abenaki, who were based in central New England and had been losing land to the British for decades. Right, so this is another way in which the French and Indian War was ahead of its time. We're familiar with the idea of a proxy war today from the Cold War and from other more recent conflicts in Europe. But basically, it's the idea that you supply the enemy of your enemy so that they can fight them and you don't have to fight them yourself. Right? That was essentially what was going on in the early quote-unquote Indian Wars, and why they earned the reputation as being called Indian Wars, because most colonists on the ground were seeing raids conducted by Native Americans. But really, these were raids that were maybe coerced, maybe rewarded quite heavily by the opposing European power. So excuse me. So essentially, each power would, like I said, sort of align themselves with a tribe or series of tribes that had been wronged by whoever they were trying to counter. And spoiler alert, the French and Indian War would eventually end in a British victory with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. And that treaty basically ceded all of France's territory, almost all of it in North America, to England, and also a lot of it went to Spain as well, because remember, this was a global conflict. But it should be no surprise that even a victorious war of this size would come with some significant costs to the British Empire. And in addition to the financial costs alone, Britain was also obliged to promise a large area of the land that they won to their Native American allies. And that was done with the Royal Proclamation of 1763, so the same year that the Treaty of Paris was signed. The British Crown pledged lands west of the Appalachian Mountains to the tribes like the Iroquois that they had helped against the French from. Because remember, all of those lands were originally taken from those tribes by the French, right? So as a pledge of alliance and payment for service, that was to be the recompense that the Indians, quote unquote, in the French and Indian War got, right? So that should be a good thing, theoretically, right? In that case, it sounds like everybody wins. The British won the war and the natives get their land back. Well, no, actually, the problem is that the British double-booked this land. They'd already promised that very same territory to colonial soldiers as payment for their service as well. So the colonies had actually raised around 25,000 of the total 40,000 troops that fought in the French and Indian War. So that's more than half. And Britain could not afford to pay that number of colonial troops a salary. So instead, what they said was, well, if you don't mind going off into Canada and fighting for us, when you come back, you can have a nice piece of land west of the Appalachian Mountains. they were getting offered essentially a cut of the spoils. It was a victory wager, a bet made, right? So you can imagine that the soldiers fighting in that conflict, it's very motivating. It gives them a lot to fight for. If they win, they'll theoretically have, anything from a couple hundred to a couple thousand acres of land. I mean, the amount of land that was being promised was significant. For example, George Washington, whose military career was built on his service in the French and Indian War, was promised over 20,000 acres of land in Ohio that he would not be allowed to settle while this native reservation established by the Proclamation of 1763 stood. So, like many colonists, Washington put pressure on Britain to end the treaty, and at one point he wrote, "I can never look upon the proclamation in any other light than as a temporary expedient to quiet the minds of the Indians. It must fall, of course, in a few years." So, the reason that all of this is significant is because to many historians, this is really where the first seeds of American mistrust in Britain were first planted. And for our purposes, it's all the result of the almighty dollar, right? The war was fought over the fur economy in the first place, right? So it was fundamentally a war of commerce. The very grounds that were gained were wagered as a form of payment. And of course, veterans' compensation wasn't in the budget, which is yet another way this conflict, in some ways, mirrors those of more recent history. Not to worry, as many colonists, like Washington, would eventually get access to their new lands once the reservation's borders were renegotiated to the greater benefit of the colonies. So I have here a map that shows different boundary lines that were drawn later in time, and that green line is the first boundary that was drawn by the Proclamation of 1763. It was then renegotiated with the Treaty of Hard Labor to that purple dotted line, so giving the colonies a little bit of land west of the Appalachians. And then again, that same year, and this would be in 1768, the Crown renegotiated again with the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which moved the boundary to that red line along the Ohio River. So the Treaty of Fort Stanwix actually cut the proclamation territory in more than half. About 65% of it then became colonial territory. So you can imagine that this would only be done, right, if Parliament was in a position where they felt like they were no longer going to be retaliated against by the Native Americans who they originally promised that land to. And they felt less vulnerable because the Crown began to financially recover, right? It's sort of a paradox, but the more land that the colonies gain, right, the more wealth that brings in for the Crown. So they had a lot of incentive eventually to sort of walk this line over and over, further and further. And while the colonists did thus get their share of the spoils for the war, they would also be given their share of the bill, right, in the form of a series of taxes, which is precisely how the Crown planned to fund their aforementioned financial recovery. So infamously beginning with the Sugar Act of 1764, at least that's what we've always been told, that's kind of true. So I find that a lot of revolutionary narratives try to portray this sense that it was the 1760s, which suddenly saw like an explosion of British taxation as the sole result of the French and Indian War. But in truth, taxes had been in place in the colonies for various reasons for at least a century before this. So the Sugar Act was actually an extension of a pre-existing act, the 1733 Molasses Act, which originally ordered a tariff of 6 pence per gallon of molasses, only from non-English sources. So the goal was just to encourage the purchase of domestic molasses. However, the effect was in places like New England, where a lot of molasses was consumed for the industries like the rum industry, that it was just often cheaper to pay smugglers to smuggle in foreign molasses than it was to pay the tax per pound, or per gallon, excuse me. So the passing of the Sugar Act then, in 1764, actually had that original tariff. The thinking was that if the colonies were going to use foreign molasses anyway, right, the British might as well make paying the tax cheaper than paying smugglers, so that the crown can at least get some profit collected, right? This came along with an increase in port security to ensure that the tax couldn't be avoided, which is what ultimately sparked protesting in places like New York, Massachusetts, and particularly Rhode Island, because at the end of the day, a 6-pence tax that you could altogether avoid costs you less than a 3-pence tax that you can't avoid at all, right? So it should be noted that these policies were meant to make it cheaper for rum manufacturers just to purchase domestic molasses in the first place, right? If you just follow the rules and buy British molasses, theoretically it's supposed to be easier, but really it's the wealthy skippers who make their livelihood via smuggling that the tax is mostly upset. And this comes to a head in Rhode Island, resulting in one of the earliest acts of violence in the colonies in 1764 with an attack on the Royal Navy's HMS St. John in Newport. So the events have been preserved in a newspaper report which reads, "The following affair, at the beginning seemed to indicate a tragic issue, happened here last Monday. Namely, some men belonging to His Majesty's schooner, St. John, then in this harbor commanded by Captain Hill, had been guilty several days before of some irregularities in town. A boat with some men armed came in quest of her. A smart skirmish was the consequence, by which it is said the schooner's men were considerably bruised and very expeditiously went off. Orders were sent over to Fort George to stop the schooner in case she should attempt going out of the harbor." So what the Newport Mercury does not note is in either these snippets or elsewhere in the newspaper or other documents, is that the quote-unquote irregularities that the St. John's Navy crewmen were accused of was just enforcing anti-smuggling measures of molasses, right? So they had been confiscating smuggled molasses, and the newspaper, cleverly left that bit of information out. And so the colonial response, naturally, was to seize the port of Newport, storm Fort George, and turn the cannons against the British Navy in the harbor. If that sounds like a story out of the golden age of piracy, that's essentially what this was, right? These are smugglers we're dealing with. So these are, men who probably would not be too different from your average privateer or pirate. But that being said, in that sense, these protests were sufficient to result in the Sugar Act's eventual repeal, if we can call them a protest at all. The reaction to the following 1765 Stamp Act would be even more widely dissenting, and that's kind of impressive considering the scale of the attack in Newport, but that's because it angered a much larger demographic than just smugglers. So unlike the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act had no precedent in the colonies. Remember, the Molasses Act had been in place for about 30 years when the Sugar Act was passed, but the Stamp Act was an entirely new concept. This was the first time that the colonies would be taxed on an internal affair rather than a matter of foreign trade. So the Stamp Act placed a variety of taxes, and there's not enough room to list them all here, but these are the most expensive ones. And these were all paper goods that required a tax in the form of an official stamp, like those shown here. And the cost of that stamp, or how many stamps you needed, would depend on the type of printing you were doing. So it ranged from 1 pence per page for newspapers to up to £10 per attorney license. And that's something like a range of 78 cents per page at the lowest, or $1,880 at the highest for an attorney license in today's currency. And that might sound extreme, but nearly identical taxes had been in place back in Britain, actually, at various times for quite a while, mostly when there was a significant need to raise the crown's revenue. The British saw a need for raising revenue in keeping a standing army of about 10,000 troops stationed in the colonies. And this was to, again, help ward off tensions over the Treaty of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, right? So the British Crown is thinking they can capitalize on raising revenue by taxing the colonies a little bit more. They can fund a standing army to help keep the lands which they're giving to the colonists secure, help keep France away because they're clearly very strong enemies and had just fought a war. So there were 10,000 troops in the colonies that were stationed and needed to be paid and supplied. And on the other hand, the prevailing colonial opinion was that the colonies raised 25,000 troops on their own, and hardly any of them got paid, and that the colonies are perfectly capable of defending themselves from people like the French or the Native Americans, that we don't really need this standing army here, so you can go get rid of this tax. It was seen as raising funds for defense had long been, especially in places like Massachusetts, a voluntary contribution. Basically, you paid into a defense fund, into the local militia, as much as you saw was necessary. And if you made a mistake, well, you'd find out. So the tax disproportionately affected things having to use paper, right? Things like academia, legal proceedings, the press. And many colonists viewed this in addition to an excuse to just keep, taxing. In addition to seeing the standing army as an excuse to keep taxing the colonies, they also viewed going about it in this particular way as an attempt by the crown to limit the influence of elite classes, right? So limit the influence of the colonial press and colonial legal institutions. But again, that's really where we get to the crux of this dissent, right? It's limiting the power and breadth of the wealthy and the elite classes, because these opinions would ultimately lead to the organization of some very large-scale protests, usually which were funded by a wealthy, interested party. And many of these happened actually to be in our own state of Massachusetts. The early nature of these protests could vary quite a bit, but a common theme would eventually become escalation. So what would begin as just the bullying of stamp officials eventually became the public burning or hanging of effigies created in stamp officials' likenesses, and in some cases, even attacks on persons or property for those who would enforce the Stamp Act. So I have an image here of an incident that happened in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, in which an angry mob assembled an effigy of the local stamp official, stuck it on a stake, tarred and feathered it, lit it on fire, and paraded it through the streets. And that was in the same year the Stamp Act was passed. So they didn't really waste any time in getting on this. Believe it or not, Haverhill actually had its own Stamp Act protest, which took place on these very grounds. So the seat of power in Haverhill had been established by the Ward family. If you're familiar with the story of Haverhill, you'll know this, but the Wards basically passed off their seat of power to the Saltonstalls by marriage. And this hill where the Buttonwoods Museum sits is where the Saltonstall estate was. It was known as the Saltonstall seat. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but so the house that's here now, the red house that you see when you come in, that was built by the Duncan family. They inherited this property from the Saltonstalls, tore down their house and built a new one in 1814. But in the 1700s, basically the entire course of the 1700s, it was the Saltonstalls who were seated here, and they were the big, family in Haverhill. And their patriarch traditionally had held the titles of town clerk and colonel of the militia, going all the way back to the late 1600s. So at this time, that would have been Richard Saltonstall. I believe it's Richard Saltonstall III, although there are a lot of Richards and a lot of Nathaniels in the Saltonstall family. They kind of alternate each generation, naming the oldest son Richard or Nathaniel. So it's easy to get them mixed up, but I believe it's the third Richard Saltonstall, who was the town clerk and the colonel of the militia. And in Merrick's History of Haverhill, which was written in the 1800s, he writes that in response to Richard Saltonstall's ratification of the Stamp Act in Haverhill, so essentially adopting it as an official clerk policy, which at that time Haverhill still included much of southern New Hampshire. So a party from the West Parish and Salem, New Hampshire, collected before his house, Richard Saltonstall, armed with clubs and other instruments to mob him. But he made them rather ashamed of their conduct. He came to the door and with much dignity told them his reasons for pursuing a different course from that which they had adopted. He ordered refreshments for them and requested them go to the tavern and call for entertainment at his expense. They accepted of his invitation and huzzaed to his praise. So much for that very short-lived protest in Haverhill. But I think it's a really perfect example, really, of how wealth and class really are the underlying themes behind all of this, right? So in reality, most of the taxable items in the Stamp Act would have little to no effect on the lives of your average lower class colonial person, which at this time was the vast majority of people. Most people who were farmers would have rented land. They probably didn't own land. They probably rented land from a man like Richard Saltonstall. They didn't write loans, right? They didn't have much business in court, and they certainly didn't have use for expensive documents like attorney's licenses. So in that frame of mind, it really makes a lot of sense why a couple hundred shillings worth of ale, and from what I found, it was around 300 shillings worth of ale, which is equivalent to about $3,000 today. So that was quite a bit of drinking money. Why that was worth more of the average person's time, rather than, swinging a club at the local town clerk. And if you're still left wanting for notions of freedom and justice, that's many of the Stamp Act's more influential protesters, who were often of the aforementioned elite classes, would probably agree with you, right? So these are familiar figures like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere. Paul Revere featured on the left, Samuel Adams on the right here, all of whom were members of the infamous Sons of Liberty, who officially formed in 1766 in response to the Stamp Act. I could say unofficially, there were actually several groups calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, and in fact the angry mob that gathered here in front of Richard Saltonstall's house called themselves the Sons of Liberty as well. So it's possible that this was a group with maybe splinter cells, or maybe it was a bunch of people got the same idea at the same time. But most members would have advised against violent protests, and would have preferred instead to establish unified resistance between the colonies. And Samuel Adams was a particular voice in this. He founded the Boston chapter of the Sons of Liberty, but he was also a Philadelphia man, and worked pretty hard to try to coordinate efforts in terms of protesting between major cities, because at this point it had been somewhat disjointed. It's the difference between protesting on a local scale against local officials and protesting on a pan-colonial scale, right? Protesting the crown directly is sort of the difference that these more organized members of the Sons of Liberty were trying to get at. But of course, that's because they have the means, right? These guys came out of merchant societies and were often, they had pretty wealthy, vast estates and had been, working in a trade for a while. John Hancock in particular, Paul Revere in particular is probably the most modest of these men. He had come out of working as a silversmith and would eventually become quite wealthy, but he came from a working class background. But we can't necessarily say the same for someone like Sam Adams, who comes from a long line of wealthy provenance. So there were understandable challenges that these men foresaw between coordinating the efforts and aligning the interests of protesters from different socioeconomic backgrounds across various regions in colonial America. But The many Sons of Liberty did share the common cause of which I'm sure we can all recite. That's no taxation without representation. That was the kind of unifying banner that they decided to unite under. And it feels like a timeless anthem to us now, right? But for the Sons of Liberty, it was actually a rather new idea at the time for several reasons. First of all, like I mentioned prior, taxation had been the norm in the colonies for a while by 1765. In fact, taxes had been in place as far back as 1651. So that's over 100 years before all of these protests that we're talking about. And that was with the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts were similar to the taxes we talked about previously. They were in place to regulate overseas shipping and related affairs. Basically, a tax put in place on shipping using non-domestic shipping, shipping with, ships leasers outside of the British Empire. And so that's the first reason that this was kind of a new idea. Protesting against taxation is kind of a new idea because for 100 years nobody really cared. Secondly, the taxes that the colonists were required to pay were barely a fraction of those that were being paid by their fellow citizens in England. So according to data by the National Bureau of Economic Research, historical data shows that for every 100 shillings paid in taxes by a British mainlander in 1765, the same year that the Stamp Act was passed, the average colonist would have paid just 3 shillings in taxes. So that's a difference of 97%, amounting to roughly paying $28 in taxes if you're a colonist for every $940 that a British citizen of the same social ranking is paying. Sorry, not a British citizen, a British resident, right? Because they're all British citizens, but of course that's translated into today's currency. So surely it seems to me like the colonists had the better end of the deal. And I kind of wonder at the sudden change of heart. Well, the concept of taxation in the first place in this time period goes back to the concept of mercantilism. You may or may not have heard of this, but this is a very simple economic idea. So mercantilism was the dominant Western economic theory prior to our current system, prior to capitalism. So it's founded on the belief that number one, wealth exists in the form of limited natural resources. That was the predicating belief of the concept of mercantilism. So that might be lumber, that could be land, agricultural goods, anything that you can source from the earth holds wealth, including things like precious metals, gold, silver, all of that. So therefore, number two, expanding a state's access to those resources increases their wealth. Resources equal wealth. The more resources you had access to, the more wealth you will have. Finally, protectionism, or the practice of encouraging domestic trade by taxing foreign imports, ensures that whatever wealth you gain from those resources does not go into the hands of competing states. So, with that understanding, colonialism makes a lot of sense, right? The very act of creating a colony is to increase your global access, to increase your global share of natural resources. The earliest taxes, like the Navigation Act and the Molasses Act, in this context make a lot more sense, right? They were in place to regulate importation, to minimize importation, and thus to serve as a sort of greater good of British mercantilism in preventing precious metals like silver, money, anything, trade goods, going into the hands of rival powers. The taxes could be avoided so long as the colonists would just trade domestically. So that is where the taxes like the Stamp Act get a more hostile reaction, right? Because they are regulating an internal institution. So this had never really been a problem. Most colonists were fairly okay with the idea of paying taxes in the name of mercantilism. Nobody articulates this difference more clearly than Benjamin Franklin, in his 1766 appeal before the British Parliament. So he stood before British Parliament in the House of Commons to speak about the Stamp Act. And he wrote, or he spoke, that an external tax is a duty laid on commodities imported. That duty is added to the first cost and other charges on the commodity, and when it is offered for sale, makes it a part of the price. If the people do not like it at that price, they refuse it. They are not obliged to pay it. But an internal tax is forced from the people without their consent, if not laid by their own representatives. The Stamp Act says we shall have no commerce, make no exchange of property with each other, neither purchase nor grant nor recover debts. We shall neither marry nor make our wills unless we pay such and such sums, and thus it is intended to extort our money from us or ruin us by the consequence of refusing to pay it. And so here we finally get to that very important component of all this, of representation. In essence, trade tariffs were not seen to necessitate representation because they were just a mercantilist regulation. But internal taxes, on the other hand, regulate the lives of people, of colonists, and should therefore consider their agreement or their disagreement. Well, this certainly raises some timeless philosophical questions. It also raises one very, very practical question, and often under-asked question, I find. Why didn't the British simply allow the colonies parliamentary representation then? If their issue is in the principle, not in the price, right? If the colonies were offered representation, it seems like in that scenario, everyone would win. Theoretically, the British would get their taxes, and the colonists would lose their sort of only argument against it. Well, the answer actually goes back to the very foundation of the colonies themselves. And that would be the colonial charters, like this one for the colony of Rhode Island. So essentially, a charter was a detailed document that enabled the settlement of a new region. And even on this first page, there are some very key words. First and foremost, we have the word colony itself, which was introduced into English in this time period from the Latin word colere, which can roughly be translated to mean to work, to tend, to live, to farm. So this word was brought in the 16th century to describe a newly emergent role in British society, that of a colonist whose fundamental purpose is to help acquire resources and further the mercantilist system. So it might be strange to us today to think of a colonist as essentially meaning a worker, right? It doesn't really mean citizen. In the context of this time period, it really meant worker. But we do have some sense of this etymology today, right? We say that worker ants, worker bees live in a colony, right? So that's sort of a remnant of that usage of the word. Okay, so there's also the phrase governor and company, of course, which, and I wish there was some etymology to unpack here, but really it's quite simple. In the colonial era, these words mean more or less exactly what they still mean today, right? A leader and a corporation, respectively. Basically, a colonial charter was a business contract between the state, the British Crown, and a private enterprise, in which the king granted rights of propriety over a region of land to a company, to a corporation, in exchange for guaranteeing that that corporation would only trade with Britain. Since any enterprise needs workers to function, English citizens would be invited to come and make their living in the colonies with their prosperity and their protection as a sort of payment for helping stimulate the economy and helping expand access to resources. Of particular emphasis in this arrangement is the citizenship of the colonists, right? So they are considered British subjects. They are entitled to the full rights and protections of any English subjects, which would be quite unlike, right, enslaved men and women who were forced to work in these colonies against their will. There's a big distinction. And again, it's a bit of a strange concept today, but the best analogy that I can find for a colony is comparable to the modern practice of franchising, in which a private enterprisee is given the right to operate a franchise under a corporation's trademark in exchange for sending all of those profits upward, right? So in the case of the colonies, the quote-unquote trademark that their business is operating under is the British flag. And they are therefore subject to both the benefits and the regulations that come along with that. This is an even better comparison when you consider that each of the 13 colonies' proprietary charters were eventually withdrawn in order for them to all become crown colonies, which has one major difference. Instead of a business arrangement between a private enterprise and the state, a crown colony was essentially an enterprise owned by the state, or by King George himself, because he's the head of state. So, while initially this sounds like it has a lot of potential to be highly tyrannical, and it certainly could be, I'll note that the ownership of a colony, of a company, was usually only ever revoked and transferred to the state in the event that that company overseeing the colony broke a law, broke the charter, and therefore voided the business agreement. So, this precisely is really where these cries for liberty and freedom come into the picture, right? We're not talking about freedom and liberty solely for the sake of the philosophical concept of it. And certainly these cries of freedom and liberty, right, we know that it's not a philosophical issue. These are coming from the same lips of those who are enslaving other people in their colony to work. Rather, we're talking about freedom for those in charge of the colonial company, to go back to running things the way that they had been, however they wanted, right? Like they were before they broke the laws of their charter and got their colony revoked. Regardless, so the result is that as crown colonies, and therefore possessions of the king, they're more or less subject to his whims, no matter how much they really want to he and holler about it. They ultimately are now property of the king because they voided their contract. That is not to say, then, that the colonists themselves are without rights. Remember, they are still English citizens. It's just that the colony's governance and all of its matters relating to its business and its commerce are the king's purview. So Parliament agreed that as English citizens, the colonists would be entitled to representation if they were to meet the required 40 shillings worth of land ownership in England. That was the condition for representation for all English citizens. So the way that the parliamentary districts, I guess you could call them, were drawn was they were drawn via county or shire in England. So for those unable to hold land in England, Parliament argued that they received what was called virtual representation. Virtual in this case is derived from the word virtue, right? Meaning as in good faith. So representation in the hearts and minds of Parliament's delegates who are representing British citizens in the British Isles, but are still meant to consider the interests of colonists overseas. Now, I'm sure you can imagine how content the colonists were to be governed by good faith. And it is a clever coincidence at this time that virtual also held the meaning that we have today of simulated. So a lot of jokes were made in the press at the idea of simulated representation. And today, we more commonly use the word virtual to mean simulated, not to mean in good faith. And that's partly because of this idea being very highly mocked. So, how did Parliament respond to colonial demands for no taxation without representation then? They didn't grant them representation, but they did eventually repeal the Stamp Act and replaced it with the Townshend Acts, named after Charles Townshend, England's Chancellor of the Exchequer, who proposed these acts in 1767. And historians do still debate which exact legislations are considered part of the Townshend Acts or not, but Some of them were passed after Townsend's death. But for our purposes, we really only care about 3 of them. The Revenue Act, the Indemnity Act, and the Commissioners and Customs Act, which are all summarized here. So whenever you hear about the Townshend Acts, they're often cited as an escalation of the tensions between Parliament and the colonies. And while we know that tension was indeed a result of the Townshend Acts today, at the time, that wasn't the intention. So, in fact, a good amount of the legislation was meant to be written with colonial interests in mind, trying to make good on that idea of virtual representation. And the Revenue Act is a great first example. So it placed an external tax, right, a tariff, on the importation of several common goods like glass, paint, paper, etc., in order to raise revenue that the Stamp Act failed to generate. And they canceled the Stamp Act. They said, okay, they have an issue with internal tax, we'll just go back to passing a tariff on some very common things that people are likely to buy, and we hope that that will raise revenue. Well, if you remember that the colony's primary argument against the Stamp Act was that it was an internal tax, Parliament should be able to pass the Revenue Act unquestioned, right? That was really Ben Franklin and all the other Founding Fathers' biggest argument against the Stamp Act. Parliament's authority to pass unrepresented tariffs had never been protested before that. It was accepted going all the way back to the Navigation Acts in 1651. So one more time, I'll draw attention to Benjamin Franklin's address to Parliament regarding the Stamp Act. An internal tax is forced from the people without their consent if not made by their own representatives. So in their subsequent repeal of the Stamp Act, Parliament was recognizing this. They recognized the unconstitutionality of an unrepresented internal tax and returned instead to import tariffs with the Revenue Act. And that should be no problem. But in addition to tariffs on commonly imported goods, the Revenue Act had a few other clauses that the colonists took issue with. The first of which being the legalization of writs of assistance. So writs of assistance are essentially search warrants. That's what we would call them today. That customs officials could use to enlist local colonial law enforcement to aid in the search and seizure of smuggled goods, rather than having officers of, say, the British Army or the British Navy do it. And while that does sound a little bit distasteful, it should be noted that the writs of assistance were the alternative to precipitating incidents like the attack on the HMS St. John that happened in Newport, Rhode Island. So Parliament saw this as a compromise, for sure. They were thinking that local sheriffs might have a better relationship with the colonists, and perhaps colonists would be more inclined to comply if it was their own authorities enforcing these taxes rather than authorities of the crown. So, you remember this attack on the HMS St. John. Of course, this happened over the fact that it was British officials, Royal Navy men, who were enforcing the tax. More general issue would be taken with the Revenue Act's second clause. Beyond writs of assistance, this last clause here sought to repurpose colonial tax revenue from this Revenue Act to pay the salaries of colonial judges and governors. Officials who had always been salaried by the colonial assemblies were now dependent upon royal compensation. So this one was a bit of a contentious point. Because on the one hand, it's actually lowering the financial burden of colonial assemblies. It's saying that you don't have to pay your officials anymore. You don't have to worry about disorder if people don't get paid and these taxes don't generate revenue. We will pay them for you, says Parliament. On the other hand, that calls into question the loyalty of colonial officials. Right? If they're no longer being paid by colonial assemblies, they may be more inclined to side with Parliament on issues like taxation, because the Revenue Act is paying their salary. So it was a sort of clever and vague move by Parliament to not only try and appease colonial colonists by lowering their financial burden, but also to try and guarantee that colonial officials would further comply in enforcing tax collection. So this was also sort of in response to the Stamp Act as well, in the sense that a big issue was the purpose of the Stamp Act being funding a standing army that the colonists saw as not necessary. So England said, okay, fine, we won't fund a standing army. Instead, we'll just fund royal official salaries. So the colonial counter to that is, you don't have to pay them. We were already paying them. Just like we didn't need you to pay our soldiers. We already recruited our own militia and we were protecting ourselves. And so for that reason, it was seen as a sort of arbitrary statement by British Parliament, a tax simply for the sake of exerting the right to pass taxes, right? A tax that is in place to pay something that has already been paid by other means. And if that sounds redundant, the Sons of Liberty certainly agreed. The Revenue Act was an outrage for many colonists for having no other purpose than to change who was paying them. Whether or not that was actually Parliament's intention does remain vague, and is probably intentionally vague. But their authority was nonetheless reinstated with the Revenue Act, and it was laid out elsewhere in the colonial charters and in the Declaratory Act of 1766, which is a separate act that was passed. Not a tax, simply just a act that was passed in response to some colonial dissent being sent back and forth about whether or not Parliament actually has the right to even pass taxes. Parliament didn't per se have the right to tax the colonies of America. The right Parliament had to tax colonies was written into the respective charters of each colony. So what the Declaratory Act does is say, well, now we have the sort of lump ability to tax all of you, to tax an act that affects all 13 colonies. We don't have to pass separate acts taxing colonies individually. We already have the authority to do that, and we're just sort of, lumping that all together as one thing. Regardless of the purpose of the Revenue Act, you might be surprised to hear that our next Townshend Act, the Indemnity Act, actually didn't raise taxation at all. It reduced it. And it had nothing to do with colonists being taxed or being taxed less. It reduced taxes for the British East India Company specifically. Before the Indemnity Act, the British East India Company had been required to export all of its tea directly to the British Isles from places like India and China. And that was in order to counteract the sale of English tea to rival powers, going back to this idea of mercantilism. The British Crown didn't want British tea being sourced from other colonial holdings being sold along the journey to powers like Spain or France or Portugal, so that they could then sell it at an upcharged price. Rather, Britain said, no, we're going to sell our own tea. So the law for decades had been that the British East India Company was required to bring all of its tea directly to the British Isles before selling it. Parliament would tax the tea in Britain, not in the colonies, and then it would be sold at the English tea auction to consigners either in Britain or consigners from the colonies, or any person who wanted to bid on tea to be able to sell it somewhere else. So this did come at the cost of raising the price of English tea out of competition. So Parliament did such a good job at preventing British tea from being smuggled that nobody wanted to buy it at all. It was too expensive given the amount of transportation that went into moving it from all the way from India to England before then going to other places. The fact that Parliament taxed it in the British colonies raised up the price again. So nobody could smuggle English tea, but they could easily smuggle the more freely available Dutch tea, because the Dutch didn't have any such law. They let their tea be sold wherever it was found. So that further plummeted the demand for British tea. And it threatened to bankrupt England's largest corporation. The concept of monopolies being a bad thing was no such thing at this time period. Mercantilism actually kind of encourages monopolies. So what the Indemnity Act did was sort of like, a bailout. It was trying to lower that initial import tax on the British East India Company's tea in order to lower its overall cost to the consumer. And at first that really didn't anger anybody, mostly because it wasn't effective. The British East India Company tea still wouldn't be cheap enough, even with the Tea Act passed, to compete with Dutch tea. So the Parliament eventually sought to pass the Indemnity Act with an augmentation by the Tea Act in 1773, which added a few provisions. First, the Tea Act not only removed the import tax on British East India Company tea altogether, it also allowed the company to forego the English tea auction. It basically allowed the English East India Company to do exactly what their competitors had been doing and sell tea wherever they wanted to bring it. They didn't have to go to England first anymore. And this was effective to lower the cost of British tea to a more competitive range with their rival powers. And believe it or not, that solution was proposed by the colonists, by colonial merchants. They said, the reason nobody's buying British tea is because it's just too expensive because of all these anti-smuggling measures you have put in place. Why don't you just let the British East India Company open up shop at docks here, and we'll just sell the tea that way and it'll be a lot cheaper. And at first that didn't anger anybody. However, news would eventually come that written into the Tea Act, in addition to removing all this red tape, was also the authority to allow the British East India Company to open their own stores directly and cut out colonial merchants, right? So the colonial merchants are the ones who proposed this compromise, and now they're not actually allowed to sell the tea. The British East India Company can just appoint merchants within the company to sell it directly to your average people who are buying it. Furthermore, the Tea Act would follow this up. Oh, too ahead of myself. There's supposed to be another bullet point here listing that the Tea Act followed this up with a 3 pence per pound tax on the sale of tea to the consumer directly. So that was no longer being paid by the British East India Company, it was being paid by people buying tea. Not only were colonial merchants then cut out of this whole operation, but it was now the Crown who would profit, because now there's a tax being collected on the tea. To be fair, the Tea Act's intention was more so to save the East India Company from bankruptcy more than it was to kind of deliberately undercut the colonies. But it was an unfortunate coincidence that it angered everybody. It angered smugglers who were previously making a profit on Dutch tea. It angered colonial merchants who now couldn't even sell British tea. And it angered your average citizen who was now paying a tax on tea that they weren't previously paying. And if you know anything about revolutionary history, and I accidentally teased the next slide, you know exactly where this is going. The infamous Boston Tea Party, organized by our aforementioned friends, the Sons of Liberty, in protest against the Tea Act in 1773. Granted, this wasn't the first measure taken against that act. Boycotts and other civil protests had been organized beforehand. And in fact, Haverhill actually had a non-importation agreement. the town officials actually got together, despite the fact that the salt installs who were in charge had been very pro-Crown up until this point. Haverhill's officials all got together, signed a non-importation agreement that they wouldn't permit the East India Company to set up shop here in Haverhill. Of course, Haverhill was off the coast and was sort of a bit of a frontier territory at that time, so they could kind of get away with doing that without angering anyone too much. But it just goes to show that the Boston Tea Party was not really the first reaction. It was kind of the last reaction. And a lot of these sort of non-importation agreements and boycotts were pretty effective. It meant that most of the tea that did get to the colonies and would be consigned to East India Company merchants was just kind of accumulating losses sitting in warehouses and rotting, which even further indebted the East India Company. And did anger Parliament, because their entire purpose of this was to try and save their biggest monopoly. So the Tea Act was never repealed, even though these protests were extremely effective, perhaps more effective than some of the previous ones. Parliament did not repeal this act because they really couldn't afford to have the East India Company go bankrupt. And so, on the night of December 16, 1773, several assemblies of men, led by Samuel Adams, boarded 4 East India Company ships and threw a total of 342 chests of tea overboard into Boston Harbor. And that was valued at the time of 9,659 pounds sterling worth of tea, equivalent to nearly $2 million worth of tea, worth of property damage today. That is definitely significant, and if Parliament wasn't angry enough, they certainly were now. And remember, this is over just a 3 pence tax, which is equivalent to about 90 cents per pound of tea today. If you were to go to a store and buy a pound worth of tea today, you'd pay a lot more than 90 cents in taxes. But the fact of the matter is that before, colonists didn't have to pay any tax. So the Sons of Liberty were insisted that their protest was not a matter of price, it was a matter of principle. And some other prominent colonists actually sided with Parliament on this one and insisted that the Boston Tea Party was principally wrong. Again, I will draw attention to Benjamin Franklin. Where did that go? There was supposed to be a slide in here with a quote from Benjamin Franklin decrying the Tea Act, and in moving this to the drive, it seems to have been lost. Basically, Benjamin Franklin viewed the Boston Tea Party as a total injustice. He said, "Our issue is not with the British East India Company, our issue is with Parliament. It doesn't do anyone any good to go and bankrupt our kingdom's our empire's most profitable company. That's going to hurt us all." And Benjamin Franklin urged the colonists, the Sons of Liberty in particular, to repay the losses that they inflicted. There was a bit of debate on this. I mean, most of the founding fathers were largely in favor of acts like the Boston Tea Party. There were some outliers, and again, that comes down to the fact that this is all about economics, right? Benjamin Franklin is taking a very, in his thinking, was taking a very financial, sort of cosmopolitan view of the incident of yes, I would love I would love my colony to be free from the rules of the British Empire, but I don't want the British Empire to go bankrupt while we're still a part of it, because that's not going to do my business or anyone's business any good. And there is a final Townshend Act that we're going to discuss, and oddly enough, It is perhaps the least radical of them, but it would eventually have the most severe outcome, and that's the Commissioners and Customs Act of 1767. So by far, this is the least far-fetched of any of the Townshend Acts, at least in my opinion. The Commissioners and Customs Act simply legislated the establishment of a distinct American Board of Customs Commissioners, headquartered in Boston, to oversee the enforcement of the accompanying revenue and indemnity acts, and also process all of the complaints and lawsuits and things and protests being filed and being performed. So it was from these offices, the Commissioners and Customs offices, that those writs of assistance that I mentioned before, those search warrants, were issued. So these offices were essentially just a more efficient way to process all of this stuff rather than having the correspondents have to go overseas back and forth between the colonies in England, setting up a little a customs office. And when colonial authorities began to falter in their summons with writs of assistance to search and seize on behalf of the Crown, the American Board of Customs extended the Commissioner and Customs Act to petition for official support in the form of 2 British regiments, the 14th and 29th Regiments, which would come to be stationed in Boston Harbor. So this act was sort of a very straightforward act of bureaucracy, but with an invitation of military presence. And that would lead to another event, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, the infamous Boston Massacre, right, in which soldiers from one of these regiments that were dispatched to enforce the Commissioners and Customs Act fired upon a crowd of rioters across the street from the Boston State House on March 5th, 1770. And sometimes it's dated as 1771 because the new year fell not in January, it fell in March back then. So sometimes you'll see it dated as 1771. But on our calendar, it would have been 1770. The incident itself actually had nothing to do with any of this. It had nothing to do with the Commissioners and Customs Act. Actually, it began as a personal dispute between a 13-year-old boy, Edward Garrick, who was an apprentice to a local tradesman, who was coming to collect a debt from Captain John Goldfinch, who owed a debt to this tradesman. I believe he was a leather worker and worked on something for this captain, and the captain didn't pay for it. So this boy was sent on an errand to go and collect the debt, and another soldier intervened and struck the boy to get him to go away. So an angry mob assembled to pelt the soldiers with really anything that they could find. We all know this story. It's not a very surprising one, given the total narrative that we know. And it's not surprising either that the Boston Massacre caused a total political uproar, because the result of this was the soldiers firing on a crowd of colonists, killing 5 of them and wounding another 6. And there was a really long trial that followed, which was sort of our earliest like true crime sensation, with witness accounts and parts of the trial being published in the newspapers. This event is partly what put John Adams on everyone's radar. He was a lawyer, and he actually defended the soldiers. It gets a little bit confusing when you read about the Boston Massacre, because the prosecution, or the Crown in this case, were actually who the soldiers were employed by, but the way that the legal system worked meant that you had to file prosecutions through the official channel. So it was the Crown prosecuting British soldiers with a colonist, John Adams, defending them. It can get really, really confusing. But one thing that's fascinating that I find in reading about the Boston Massacre is that if you look at the accounts, if you look at the depositions of the witnesses, the Crown, the prosecution, only called upstanding white male citizens, whereas the defense, John Adams, in trying to acquit these soldiers, called on anyone he could get his hands on. He put enslaved people on the stand. He put women and children on the stand. He put anyone on the stand, and it was proven to be very effective. These soldiers actually were acquitted of murder. They were not found guilty, which I'm sure was kind of a conflicting sentiment in the minds of a lot of colonists. But this is sort of a line in the sand that was drawn by, certain founding fathers like John Adams, similarly to how Ben Franklin drew a line in the sand about the Boston Tea Party. There were certain things that, because these men were members of the elite classes, that they did want to do things as sort of above board as they could. And John Adams saw this, the alternative, right? These soldiers being convicted of murder would be tantamount to an act of war, right? His defending them and getting them acquitted is basically sort of suing for peace in a sense, because if they're not guilty of murder, then this isn't really an act of the British Crown unjustly firing on colonial citizens, right? So there is this constant push amongst the founding fathers to sort of throw off the yoke of the British Crown, but also keep enough that sort of benefits them until the very last moment. And I think that the Boston Massacre is sort of a really good framing event for the legacy to come between, that would come between the British Crown and the colonists, right? And of course, we all know that legacy is one of war, in which the Crown and British soldiers and colonists would be fighting each other. And in our modern memory of that American Revolution, in our modern memory of the American Revolution, that relationship of war, right, of colonists versus the crown, of patriotism, sort of tends to occupy the most attention in the narratives that we tend to tell today. But as we have learned, more about the conditions which predated the revolution, all of this economic jargon kind of leading up to it, the greater the possibility becomes that our knowledge of the ending, our knowledge of how it turned out, can be flavoring our understanding of how it started, right? Ideals of liberty and patriotism are definitely not a small factor, right? They form the majority of the revolutionary narrative, both today and back then. It was talked about quite a lot. But despite what was said, when we sort of diagnose the principles of it, those philosophical notions were often motivated by, or at the very least adjacent to, their economic principles, their sort of economic counterparts leading up to the war. Really, what we find when we look at the legislations most commonly cited as the motivation for the revolution are laws that are intended to counteract smuggling or otherwise just regulate commerce, right, which was lawfully predicated in the colonial charters. We have found through, we've learned that in the case of the Stamp Act and the many other taxes, in the event that an act violated the English Bill of Rights, colonists were able to appeal to Parliament, and that generally would result in its revocation. The only one that wouldn't be repealed was the Tea Act, but and acts coming after the Boston Tea Party. But the trend is that the colony's resistance was strongest in the elite classes that had the most to lose from these regulations, right? In many ways, the coming American Revolution can really be boiled down to a war, yes, but really it's a battle between the interests of the state versus the interests of corporations. And in some ways, I think that it is an even better sort of predictor of some things that still happen in the US today, right? It's kind of a hard concept to imagine, but it's like, imagine if a company, like say Amazon or something, a huge company today got permission from the U.S. government to just go and buy an island and just run that island however they wanted. And they had an agreement that any money we make will be U.S. tax revenue. And slowly but surely they sort of, pushed the boundaries of what they were and weren't allowed to do. And then finally a company decided to declare war on a nation. I mean, that's ultimately what the American Revolution legally was. We don't conceive of it like that now because those companies all got together and started a country. But that's what I mean when I say our knowledge of how it turned out kind of flavors our understanding of how it started. And if you'd like to know about how all of these philosophical and sort of financial conflicts of interests do intersect to erupt in a literal war, by show of force, by show of arms, then you're welcome to join us again next month for part 2 of Written by the Victors, Remembering the American Revolution, in which we'll break down a bit more of this same sense of modern notions of the idea of the war for independence that may have been different in the actual time period, looking specifically at the point after war was declared. But I'm happy to take any questions if you have any, and I appreciate you sticking with me through all of this kind of somewhat dense material. I have some sources here. This website, American Class, is really great. They have a lot of primary source documents if you're interested in reading about this kind of thing. I'm happy to take any questions if you have them.
Have you?
Who was the lawyer who was the prosecuting lawyer in the Boston Massacre trial?
That's a really good question. So it would have been whoever the supreme supreme lawyer prosecutor for the Crown was in Massachusetts at the time. I don't know their name.
So it would have been a Crown.
Yeah, it would have been a royal official. Yeah.
So those roles were really kind of.
They were. Yeah, I know. It's really interesting the way that the legal system worked back then. They hadn't quite ironed everything out,
and that did work in their best interests of keeping peace. When you had a colonist defending British military and the Crown prosecuting British military.
So it was really like you had dual motivations on both sides, because it's the people who called for the Crown to put those soldiers on trial, right? It's the people who said, no, they're murderers, you need to do something about it. So the Crown said, okay, we'll get a prosecutor we'll get a case together, we will try them. And then some wealthy colonists who said, I think that would be kind of bad for business if they were actually convicted. As much as I may or may not like what happened here, I'm not quite ready to go to war with England yet. So I better get them acquitted, so that we can have peace for a little while longer. Yeah, that's sort of my conception of it.
But it also almost seems like having colonists be the defender means that allegedly he would have worked really hard
and he did
to not get him acquitted.
That's what you would think.
I mean, that would be like the surface view.
Exactly, which is why I sort of tie this back into economics, right? Mm-hmm. Because the economical decision certainly is to maintain the ties with England. Even if the patriotic decision is to, condemn those soldiers. It is really interesting, and you know that John Adams was working really hard to get them acquitted, because, like I said, he would throw anyone up on the stand that he could. Yeah. The overwhelming opinion, majority was that it was a instance of basically an instance of police brutality, right? That not too dissimilar to some of the things we see today, but a law enforcement body firing upon citizens unjustly. So a lot of people were angry and were willing to go to war over it.
And women and children and slaves would not have been in a courtroom.
No, that would have been very unusual. It's not like it never happened, But usually when it did, if they were in a courtroom, they were being tried. Usually, like enslaved people or women or children could be in a courtroom, but usually they would have been, the accused. So calling on them as witnesses was sort of very ahead of its time. Which again is that's why I love the Boston Massacre. It's a super interesting. I love studying the Boston Massacre because it's super interesting, sort of multifaceted, issue for sure.
So you brought up Hannah Duston in the context of the French and Indian War.
Yes.
So even though she was captured by natives, it was, the bigger picture was that there was
That's
fighting.
right. So it wasn't the French and Indian War, but it was an Indian War, right? It was what we now call King William's War.
Okay.
At the time, the colonists probably would have just called it the war or the Indian War, right? But it was a war over the fur trade. So France and England were fighting for control of the fur trade in sort of the northern regions of New England. And as a result, the Abenaki had been wronged quite a few times by the British, just by proximity, having been a tribe or a band of Native Americans that lived in northern New England. They had lost quite a lot of land to England. So France decided to arm and supply and possibly pay the Abenaki to exact revenge, right? They said, well, you have animosity towards the British already, and if you already don't like them, we'll help you attack them. And so in King William's War in 1697, that raid was conducted by just by Abenaki, and Hannah Duston was captured along with other colonists. In the second raid on Haverhill in 1708, as part of Queen Anne's War, French militia actually did accompany the Abenaki. So it was a dual effort. The Abenaki were, I would say, probably the majority force, but there were French militia present. So that, at that time, there may have been more of a notion in the minds of your average citizen that these wars were being fought by colonial powers. It wasn't necessarily just a random raid by Native Americans, but now we definitely know that, it was basically a proxy war, at least in the earlier days, that Britain and France were sort of capitalizing on the fact that both of them had treated Native Americans very poorly, so they could sort of recruit those tribes that didn't like their rival and get them to exact revenge. Yeah, so thank you both for coming very much. I appreciate it, and I hope to see you again next time for part 2.